Getting towards the end of the day. Hope everyone still has some energy. If not, there's so much coffee available. Please go and fuel up. I'd like to welcome Oliver from gov.dao.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. Yes, my name is Oliver. I'm the founder of gov.dao. Our mission is to build better governance by building better DAO technology. I'm also general counsel to a number of DeFi and CeFi protocols and projects. I've been a lawyer in the space for 5 years, but a lawyer for 10 years. My background's in investment funds, financial and corporate law. I'm here today to discuss privacy and the regulations around privacy, and particularly how they relate to Web3. And of course, that's super relevant for what the hackers are doing today. And it's a really interesting question because, of course, we have these regulations. There are 130 countries which have some form of data protection law. Or privacy law. Obviously, we're probably all aware of the EU's GDPR. In the UK, we've got the Data Protection Act. And in the US, there's various forms of I think it's 5 different pieces of legislation. I'm not here to go into the detail of the regulations, because probably there's not enough coffee in the world to get through that. But I think that there's 4 key things, really, when it comes to data protection law and privacy, which is that projects need to treat data in a fair way, in a transparent way, with accuracy and with security. And those are kind of the 4 main pillars that all projects should consider when they're thinking about data protection and privacy. However, that's for Web 2. If you're Web 3, it becomes a lot more difficult. And the reason why is because, of course, we're talking about decentralized projects. We're talking about if you are truly decentralized, there's not one owner, there's not one controller, there's not one central entity to protect data. Now, if you're truly decentralized, then what do you do? Because, and this is the huge conflict with Web3 and data protection laws. Because if you think about what Web2 companies have to do, they have to give notice to their users as to how they're going to treat their data. They need to give choice to their users and give them the option to opt out of their data being treated in a particular way. There's also an obligation to destroy data after a certain time. And also, we're going to throw in AML and CTF laws there, because one of the big things that we all have to consider when we're providing financial services is how we KYC. And KYC, of course, means collecting data. So, if you're decentralized, is there really one entity? Is there one controller? Not really. So, how are you going to give notice? How are you going to give a choice to your users? How are you going to destroy the data that's already on the public blockchain? I mean, the whole point of blockchain is transparency, right? If a transaction happens, it will be on the blockchain. It will be there for the record. And how do you destroy that? I think probably that's impossible. So what do you do? Well, I think there are a number of solutions, really, which is that if you are truly decentralized and you're offering a service, say you've got like a dev code structure, and you've got your protocol, your project, let's say it's a decentralized exchange. I think that's a good use case to discuss in this circumstance. You're going to have your Web3 wallets interacting with the protocol, but they're anonymous. But actually, perhaps because you're not really decentralized, you have to be registered as a virtual asset service provider. And that's a whole different talk for another day, as to whether or not you need to be registered as a virtual asset service provider. But at the end of the day, there are still things you can do. So if you've developed some software, you've developed your smart contracts, you've deployed them, and it's running and you're providing that service, the best thing to do is to think about how you can be compliant by managing risk. And the best thing to think about is, well, if the whole service that we're providing is actually on the public blockchain, then what you need to do is like, okay, we can maybe have our privacy policy, which basically notifies the users of the blockchain as to how the data is treated. But then we're talking about building privacy solutions. The hackers are building privacy solutions today. And that's really important because and I'll come to the case study of Friendtech, which is that if you are offering a service which promises privacy in some way, then you're going to have to think about compliance. Because if there is some sort of breach of privacy, and you've promised that something will be private, you're in big trouble. You're in big trouble. So why have I used Friendtech as an example here? Is anyone familiar with Friendtech here? SocialFi, yeah. So last year, they suffered what a lot of users said was a big breach of privacy, which is that someone essentially scraped data and published wallets which were tied to public Twitter profiles. And there was a huge outroar. All the users were like, oh my God, this has been a huge data breach. We want to sue Friendtech. But what's interesting is that actually, they haven't been sued yet. And why haven't they been sued yet? Well, their argument is it was always going to be public. There was no expectation of privacy. So users can't say, well, I thought it was private. I thought our chat rooms were private. I thought my wallet was private. No, you used Friendtech, you used that protocol, knowing that you were going to link your Twitter profile with your wallet, and therefore there's no expectation of privacy. And Friendtech, interestingly enough, actually have a privacy policy. So if you go onto their main page, the first thing you'll see is a privacy policy. And this is really important because that ticks a couple of the boxes. It ticks the notification. It tells the users how their data is going to be treated. But more importantly, that particular privacy policy doesn't make a promise that the data will be kept private. So where does that take us for our hackers today? If I was advising the hackers today, I would say, if you're building something which is essentially privacy, like software as a service privacy, and you're selling that to a client, you need to make sure that your product does what it says on the tin. So if your client has basically licensed it from you and they're using it, you need to make sure that it does actually maintain privacy. If you're building a service which has some sort of privacy layer on top of it, you need to make sure that it is actually going to keep data private. And you actually maintain compliance with all of the things that are required under the regulations. I'll put it to the floor for some questions.
I have a question about the opt-out thing. For example, with regard to like GDPR. So say that there's like a shit token, right? That I bought 20 years from now. I don't want my children to know that I bought like 1,000 cum rocket. But like cum rocket is immutable, so they can't delete the transactions from the ledger. And at some point, I got doxxed, so they know this address is mine. Is there a possibility that we might actually have regulators like the EU saying certain applications of blockchains, at least like immutable contracts, where therefore like these transactions can no longer be deleted and I no longer have this right to be forgotten, are de facto like incompliant and therefore illegal? Or do we think that it's very likely that regulations will kind of like evolve to take this into account?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. My answer to that would be don't expect to have any right to privacy in the future, because at the time of interacting with the protocol, purchasing those tokens, you did so with the knowledge that that was on the blockchain, then that would always be public. And as I mentioned at the start, the big problem for Web3 projects is that essentially it's built around smart contracts, public blockchain. There is no way for them really to comply. And the regulations assume that there's a central entity or central party which is able to actually take these actions. But as I said, even if you wanted to destroy the data, I mean, can anyone tell me here how you go about deleting transactions on the blockchain? Is that possible? No.
You can maintain the transaction, but you can, like, it depends how the transaction works, right? So if the transaction is just writing to state, and that state itself is mutable, then, and the owner of the contract has the ability to mutate the state in the future, it can be, like, the transaction itself will stay in the past, and somebody can, like, rerun the whole state of the blockchain and see that that transaction has happened, but in the current state of the blockchain, you can change it so that the data is no longer there, right? It's like removing a page from like a Google search engine. Somebody that scraped Google way back in the day will still have the link, and if that page still exists, they can access it, or like pull it from archive.com. because there's a difference between something being immediately available and something being available only if you have access to archival data.
Yeah, I would agree with you. However, I mean, I'm assuming that when you've purchased your Rocket token, that you've used an anonymous wallet. You don't have to answer that question. And that's another question, because up until now, up until these new AML and CTF regulations have come in, which basically will require projects, even if they're DeFi projects, because let's face it, most DeFi projects aren't really decentralized, to collect user data like your name, your address, probably who you're sending to, anything over 1,000. You may have heard of the travel rule, which is coming in, which means that any exchange or like any wallet you're sending to or whatever will have to collect this data. So up until now, actually, the only thing that's public is your wallet, right? And the transaction. So there's nothing really to tie your name, or there's no personal data that actually needs to be deleted, right? But that won't be the case in the future, because I think that projects are going to have to collect this data if they want to be compliant, and therefore they're going to have to really comply with this stuff. But then we're talking more about centralized Web2 operations in some ways. And then they're going to have to think about abilities to actually delete that. Any other questions? Well, I'm a lawyer. I can answer some questions for you. Yeah, yeah, go for it. Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, what I put today, I sent something into the Discord chat, which was basically 9 pointers that the hackers should think about when it comes to building their products. Because I think it's really easy to build a product and then later think, oh my God, I need to be compliant. What do I do? And as a lawyer, I'm constantly having to advise projects on, on being compliant after the fact, after they built it. So I think it's really important if you're a dev and you're building, really think about how you can build into the functions of your product ways to be compliant. Forward think how to do it, because I think it's no longer the case that you can be like, oh, I'm just decentralized because we're non-custodial. That's just really not the case.
So obviously companies outsource things all the time, and the outsourced company may or may not do a good job of it. So where you have like liability for something, then the liability will just go up the chain. Whoever outsourced them would be liable.
Liable for what though?
Well, so for damages, for example. But if you have something like MiCA, like you're breaching MiCA because you're not collecting enough KYC, and that was outsourced to a reputable KYC provider, and it turned out they weren't doing their job, how liable would the project at the top of the chain be?
Fully liable, although if you're wrapped with a limited company, then of course it'll be limited by shares. So, but then again, what are you being liable for? If it's the regulator coming and suing you, then I'd say there's no cap on that, right? But if you're talking about liability to your users, say there's been a hack on your protocol and they've lost their funds, then there would be, that would obviously go through the court, and liability would be subject to limitation if there were terms and conditions. Well, no, 100%. It's much easier to use a third-party KYC provider, right? And there's some great ones like SumSub, etc. So I would actually recommend that projects do use trusted third-party providers who have been in the game for a while, know what they need to do, and have already started to build in a way which will enable projects to be compliant with things like the travel rule.
Is outsourcing this to a third-party sufficient for the transfer of liability, or might liability still go back to the outsourcer? Like, I mean, setting aside like you knowing ahead of time that they're not good at their job, right? No, like you're assuming that they're good at their job. You did like an appropriate amount of due diligence, best effort, but it turns out that like I don't know, they were nefarious or they fucked up.
I mean, maybe this is too simple a response or too simple a view of it, but to be honest with you, what is a compliance provider? They're literally collecting passports, address details, doing like a check on the chain to see if there's any sanctioned wallets interacting with it, whatever. That's not that hard in my opinion. And as long as you're able to show and you've got records that you've done this, you will be compliant. No guarantees, but
Hey, hello
Hey
here. Just 5 cents. I suddenly remembered ICO times, and now I'm like, not many people went into jail for those stuff. But if they would follow your advice, they should all be compliant. They should all work slow and stuff like that. So it's interesting that there's a certain market chaos that always would require support of the lawyers, but they don't give a shit in that sense. And it's a bit kind of like, oh, let's do and then see later. But the second thing is that I always ask compliant to who, and basically what not you are pitching, but we're in this thing of America-centric compliance trajectory or Europe-American-centric.
this is so US-centric.
Yes, I'm like, why should, it's not how the world works. So it's interesting how many different compliant geographies you would map down in sense of, I don't know, if someone works in China, for example, there's how many of those so-called compliant geographies, directions, or like continents you would map down as kind of also with the dialogue with the states in this regards?
Yeah, I mean, that's a phenomenal question. That's still, because I think there's a couple of ways that you have to be compliant. You have to obviously maybe be compliant with privacy regulations, but then you also have to maybe be compliant with digital asset laws. Let's take the digital asset laws, because for me, this is a huge question, and the projects I work with are, okay, so if we set up in the BVI, we establish our company, then we'll get our VASP registration there. I'm like, great, but that only actually gives you permission to operate from the BVI. It doesn't give you permission to provide services in the EU. Because if you want to provide services in the EU, then you're going to be MiCA, right? And my advice is that just look at where your biggest markets are. Get licensed in those markets where your biggest market is. There's no point being like, oh, we're going to get a UK license, BVI license, Singapore license, Hong Kong license, because that's expensive for a start. I mean, you're talking like millions in terms of being regulated everywhere. It's just not an efficient strategy. You're going to waste all your money on legal expenses and whatever to be licensed on these places. No. Be licensed in the place where you establish or you're mainly operating from, and then be licensed in those jurisdictions where your biggest markets are. And then for privacy, well, the reason I have the EU at the top there is because I'd say that the EU is one of the leaders in terms of data protection. And it's also important because jurisdictions who interact with the EU have to almost ensure that their data protection laws are kind of in line with the EU. So I would say that following EU law is a good way to go to be compliant. However, you were saying, do we have to be compliant? Well, good question. I mean, I think, honestly, unless you're truly decentralized, and that's really, really hard, then probably yes. But that's just my opinion.
What would it look like to be truly decentralized?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I guide people to the Financial Action Task Force recommendations of October 2021, because this is the first time that that particular governing body brought into scope virtual assets. And in that guidance, it basically talks about what DeFi is and who has to be registered as a virtual asset service provider. And what they say is, if there is one central entity which maintains or has significant influence or control over a protocol, it's likely that they're not going to be DeFi. And I think there are some characteristics. So, for example, are you hosting the website, the domain? You have control. Are you taking fees? Are you profiting from the protocol's activities? You have control. Are you the owner of the intellectual property? Are you the sole person who's updating it, maintaining it? You have control. So how do you be sufficiently decentralized? Well, good question. Uniswap was a good example for a while because they weren't taking fees. They flicked the fee switch and, oh, hello, they've got a Wells notice from the SEC because that all of a sudden they're profiting from the activities. IPFS. Spread the hosting around different nodes. Don't take fees. Open source. That would be a good start.
Sorry, do you mind if I jump in? Just based on
It's really hard, by the way. I mean, someone's got to control something, right? I mean,
Just based off, you mentioned there, are you the only one contributing? So would you say that being open source is not sufficient? You've actually got to be, and all of the contributions coming from one organization, that would count as not decentralized. You need to have your contributions coming from multiple separate entities.
I would say that's what I'm saying, yes. And I think if we look at decentralized autonomous organizations, DAOs, that's really important because, obviously there was the huge DAO boom back in 2021 because everyone thought, oh, if we're like decentralized in this way and the community's running it and governing it, then we're going to be outside of the scope of legislation. But now, following the Financial Action Task Force recommendations I just mentioned, they say that if there is someone or multiple people with 10% or more control of the tokens, then they would likely have to be registered as a virtual asset service provider. And what's really weird, actually, is that everyone's like, oh, okay, so we'll set up a DAO LLC. That will help us. But funnily enough, that makes it one central entity in control. So is that a good idea? I don't know.
So let's put something into context. Because we met in Barcelona and stuff like that.
Yes, we did.
And I'm trolling in a nice way people from Catalonia that they're building Catalan stack independent for Catalans. From Aragon DAO, Vogdoni voting, rollups, blah, 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 identity things. And then imagine that they need to be compliant to Spanish government, although they're politically not aligned, they don't want to, whatever. And they don't want to be exposed within their organization, within whatever they do. I'm not saying malicious acting, also like supporting horizontal activities, supporting local communities if the next COVID will be there and stuff like that. And you never know what will be the political climate within the next government in Madrid, and then how you would even approach that. In sense of what would be your, it's not legal advice in sense of official, now your statement, but how you would approach this thing that basically you operate from the locality that should be compliant to your kind of like political opponent, to say at least.
Yeah, I mean, so what you're talking about is outside of the scope of financial laws, which are, we're talking about here. We're talking about political laws, I suppose. And you know what happened with the referendum, and you know what happened to, can't remember his name now, but he basically went into hiding, right? Was that, yeah. But let's say now because they were thinking about it. Well, I mean, what's regulating that? What's regulating them wanting to form an organization for political purposes? I don't know myself, and I'm not familiar with the Spanish law on that either. So, unfortunately, I can't answer that question. Who's hacking here, by the way? And what are you building right now? Okay, and what are the privacy features of that? Are there any privacy features?
Oh, I'm getting looped into an interview here.
I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but I think it's good to. I'm here as a mentor, guys. So, and as I said, it's really important if you are building some privacy solutions or you're providing a service which has privacy aspects to really think about compliance. Because if you're promising some sort of privacy for something, then you need to ensure that you are compliant.
So in this case, it's connecting Gitcoin Passport, which has a bunch of stamps that I'm not in control of. And then I get a score. And then based on the score, I add you to a group in a ZK pool. So you can show that you're like a member with a score, let's say above 5, but not what your specific score is.
Okay, so you're using ZK solutions to ensure privacy. So there's like anonymity in some respects, I think.
Pseudo. Yeah.
And based on what I've said, do you think that you would need to collect the user's data or whoever's using that service? This is a test now, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, it's a good one. I don't know, because the data is already public, because they're exposing it via the Gitcoin APIs, so anybody can query it at any time already. I'm just creating a timestamp saying, like, at this moment in time, this was a score, and then it's being stored.
That's great. So that's what takes us back to the very first point, and the fact that if it's already on the public blockchain, then it's super hard to actually comply with these privacy rules, because there's already public, right? So what I would suggest for you is to just have some like a privacy policy, some terms and conditions, which basically says this is what we're doing with the data, and then that would probably cover you.
Amazing. Thank you so much. This is some of the best discussion I think we've had all weekend. I really, really enjoyed it. This is so good. Thank you so much.